A good day to one and all. Today we shall discuss the topic 8 limbs of yoga, which is a very important topic that is included in the course Early Indian Philosophy of the BA Philosophy program of the University of Kerala. Let us begin by looking at what the term yoga means. The term yoga is derived from the Sanskrit root yuj, which means the union of the individual consciousness or the soul with the universal consciousness or the spirit. Yoga is a 5,000-year-old science. Some scholars are even of the opinion that it could even be much older than that. It is a very, very important body of Indian knowledge. Though many think of yoga only as a physical exercise where people twist, turn, and stretch and breathe in the most complex ways, these are actually only the most superficial aspects of this profound science of unfolding the infinite potentials of the human mind and the soul. In Vedic Sanskrit, yoga from the root yuj means to add, to join, to unite, or to attach in its most common literal sense. By figurative extension, from the yoking or harnessing of oxen or horses, the word yoga took on broader meanings such as employment, use, application, performance, etc. All further developments of the sense of this word yoga are post-Vedic. More prosaic moods such as exertion, endeavor, zeal, and diligence are also found in Indian epic poetry. Moving on to the historicity of yoga, according to Panini, a 6th century BC Sanskrit grammarian, the term yoga can be derived from either of the two roots, yujur yoga, which means to yoke, or yuj samadhau, which means to concentrate. In the context of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the root yuj samadhau, which indicates to concentrate, is considered by traditional commentators as the correct etymology. In accordance with Panini, Vyasa, who wrote the first commentary on the Yoga Sutras, states that yoga means samadhi or concentration. According to Surendranath Dasgupta, the term yoga can be derived from either of the two roots, yujur yoga, which means to yoke, or yuj samadhau, which means to concentrate. The practice of yoga is believed to have started with the very dawn of civilization itself. The science of yoga has its origin thousands of years ago, long before the first religions or belief systems were born. In the yogic lore, Shiva is seen as the first yogi or Adi Yogi and the first guru or the Adi Guru. The number of seals and fossil remains of the Indus Valley civilization with yogic motifs and figures performing yoga sadhana suggest the presence of yoga in ancient India. The phallic symbols, seals, or idols of mother goddesses are also suggestive of the presence of Tantra yoga. Presence of yoga is available in folk traditions, Indus Valley civilization, Vedic and Upanishadic heritage, Buddhist and Jain traditions, darshanas, epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, theistic traditions of the Shaivas, the Vaishnavas, and the Tantric traditions. In addition, there was a primordial or pure yoga which has been manifested in mystical traditions of South Asia. This was the time when yoga was being practiced under the direct guidance of a guru, and its spiritual value was given special importance. It was part of upasana, and yoga sadhana was inbuilt in most of the rituals. Sun was given the highest importance during the Vedic period. The practice of Surya Namaskara may have been invented later due to this influence. Pranayama was a part of daily ritual to offer oblations. Though yoga was being practiced in the pre-Vedic period, the great sage Maharshi Patanjali systematized and codified the then existing practices of yoga, its meaning and its related knowledge through the now very famous Yoga Sutras. After Patanjali, many sages and yoga masters contributed greatly for the preservation and development of the field through their well-documented practices and literature. Now let us take a look at what yoga signifies in a very important text of the Indian philosophical tradition called the Bhagavad-Gita. We all know that the Bhagavad-Gita is often referred to as a Yoga Shastra. The Bhagavad-Gita describes 4 different kinds of yogas. They are Jnana Yoga, which is basically a path of yoga focused on knowledge as a means of liberation. The second is the path of Bhakti Yoga, which is a path which involves complete devotion and surrender to the Almighty. The third important yoga that is discussed in the Bhagavad Gita is Karma Yoga, which is basically a yoga of action. This is the path of yoga that gives suggestions of how a person should perform actions in this world. That is, a person should perform actions in such a way that the focus is entirely on the action and there is no preoccupation of the mind on the results of the action. It never denies that the results of the action will reach the person, but anyway, it simply focuses on the ideal that only when a person engages in action in a completely concentrated manner, it is only then that a person can actually attain to yoga. The fourth system of yoga that is discussed in the Bhagavad Gita is Raja Yoga, which is actually a yoga of psychic control. And this is often referred to as the king among the systems of yoga. There are 2 classical definitions for yoga that one can find in the Bhagavad Gita. The first definition is Yoga Karmasu Kaushalam, which actually occurs in the second module, the 50th verse of the Bhagavad Gita, and it means that dexterity in action is actually yoga. Any action that is performed with complete concentration and absorption of the mind leads to yoga. The second important definition that one can find in the Bhagavad Gita is Samatvam Yoga Uchyate. This occurs again in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita in the verse 48. This definition means that equanimity is yoga, the ability to maintain one's balance of mind while experiencing the dualities of life. That verily is yoga, according to this definition. Moving on, let us now come to Patanjali's system of yoga. Patanjali defines yoga as the state of the cessation of the modifications of the mind. This we can see described and defined in the second sutra of the aphorisms composed by Patanjali. And the second aphorism runs like this: Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Patanjali explains yoga as a process that involves 8 limbs or 8 steps. They are Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana and Samadhi. Now let us take a detailed look at each limb of yoga. We begin with the first limb given by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, that is Yama. Basically, Yama represents the ideal of restraint on thoughts and actions. We are all aware that an ordinary human being completely engages in all the senses that are available to him, and the mind as well as the senses are continuously running after their respective objects. This kind of indulgences in the senses basically result only in what is called as the dissipation of human energy. So therefore, the first limb of yoga directs the human being to control his thoughts and actions through a series of don'ts. Now, these don'ts are basically what are called as the yamas. Now, what are these yamas? The yamas basically are 5 in number. They are satya, which is truthfulness, ahimsa, which is non-injury, asteya, which is non-covetousness, aparigraha, which is non-acceptance of gifts, and brahmacharya or celibacy. Now, satya basically demands an aspirant of yoga to abide by truth in thought, word and deed. Similarly, ahimsa requires a sadhaka to perform non-injury in thought, word and deed. It does not merely have a negative connotation of not causing injury to others, but it also carries with it the positive connotation of universal love for all beings in this world. The third is asteya, which is non-covetousness, which requires a sadhaka not to attempt to make one's own anything that genuinely belongs to any other person. The fourth is aparigraha, which is basically a non-acceptance of gifts. And the fifth is brahmacharya. Brahmacharya is roughly translated into English as celibacy, but in fact, brahmacharya is something much more than that. It is a life that is led in such a manner that the entire life is rooted in the divine. All the thoughts, all the ideas, the actions, everything has to be basically pivoted on the divine, and that is basically the true meaning of brahmacharya. Moving on to the second limb of yoga, it is Niyama. And Niyama basically represents a series of acts of self-culture. They are different suggestions given by Maharshi Patanjali for cultivating different virtues within the sadhaka. Now let's take a look at the different niyamas. Like the yamas, the niyamas are also 5 in number. They are shaucha, which is basically the purification of the body, santosha, which is contentment, tapas, which is the practice of austerities, swadhyaya, which is regular self-study of sacred books, and finally Ishvara Pranidhana, which is the worship and meditation of God. To take a detailed look at all these niyamas, shaucha basically represents the ideal that the sadhaka or the aspirant of yoga should maintain complete purity at the physical and the mental level. Santosha represents a state of mind where a person is completely contented. And a state of contentment basically results in calming down the mind and stifling all the mental modifications. And we know that the ultimate aim of yoga, as described by Patanjali itself, is the cessation of all the modifications of the mind. So therefore, the practice of contentment or santosha contributes in a very big way for stifling all the mental modifications. The third is tapas. Tapas is basically the practice of different forms of austerities to make both the body and mind very, very strong and powerful. True yoga can never be accomplished by a person who is weak in the body and mind. It requires a very, very powerful body and mind to become accomplished in the practice of yoga. So therefore, the practice of tapas is absolutely necessary in achieving success in the path of yoga. The fourth is Swadhyaya. There are two ways in which the ideal of Swadhyaya is defined. Swadhyaya primarily or literally refers to the practice of the study of sacred books. The regular self-study of sacred books helps the sadhaka to keep himself or herself abreast of the ideals that are contained in the various sacred scriptures, and thereby it helps the sadhaka to maintain mental purity and focus. But it also means an inquiry into the true nature of the self. So Swadhyaya is also a technique whereby a person looks into oneself and tries to understand the true nature of the self. So these are the two important shades of meaning that we can find regarding the notion of Swadhyaya. Finally, the last of the Niyamas is Ishvara Pranidhana, which is the worship and meditation of God. It is not merely a ritualistic worship of God, but it is a complete self-giving to the divine. It is an act of complete self-surrender to the divine, where each and every element of the human personality is voluntarily given up to the divine. So these are the 5 niyamas. And basically, yamas and niyamas constitute the moral disciplines that help the practitioner of yoga or the sadhaka to condition his body, mind, life and actions in tune with the ultimate end of yoga. Moving on, we move on to the third limb of yoga, which is called as asana. That basically represents bodily posture. We know that the modern world basically understands or identifies yoga with asana. But asana is merely just one limb of yoga. There is much, much more to yoga than merely the performance of asana. And asana is defined in the Yoga Sutras, in the Sadhana Pada, verse 46, by Patanjali Maharshi as Sthira Sukham Asanam. So it basically suggests that a sadhaka should adopt a comfortable and steady posture. So the practice of different kinds of asanas aiming at physical and mental perfection, that was developed much later in different specializations in yoga. We do not find them in Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga. Moving on to the fourth limb of yoga, it is pranayama or control of breath. Basically, prana is cosmic energy and its most evident manifestation is our breath. So, pranayama is the control of breath. And pranayama involves 3 important stages. They are puraka, which is the intake of breath to the maximum capacity. The second stage is kumbhaga, which is the retention of breath. And finally, rechaka, which is exhalation. So these are the 3 elements of the practice of pranayama. And pranayama is a very, very important and strategic science, because prana and the control of prana that is basically indicated by pranayama is essential for the simultaneous control of both the body as well as the mind. So pranayama helps a sadhaka to gain mastery over both the body as well as the mind simultaneously. Moving on to the 5th limb of yoga. The 5th limb of yoga is Pratyahara. And Pratyahara basically represents the withdrawal of the senses. The five senses have a natural tendency to flow towards their respective objects. The senses are withdrawn during the practice of Pratyahara from their objects through constant practice. They are redirected inward to the inner self. Withdrawal of senses basically results in the mastery over the senses. And Pratyahara is also important basically for bringing together the entire energy within the human personality. Both the physical as well as the psychic energy has to be concentrated, and the withdrawal of that energy and the storing up of that energy within the human personality is absolutely necessary for a sadhaka to move on to the higher limbs of yoga. So the stage of Pratyahara basically is very, very important. It marks an important stage of transition in yoga. Now we have to understand next, before we go on to the next limb of yoga, we need to understand the difference between what is called as Bahiranga Yoga and Antaranga Yoga. The first 5 stages of yoga, Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, they are external preparatory stages of yoga, and hence they are called as Bahiranga Yoga. Once a person is firmly established in Bahiranga Yoga, then Antaranga Yoga or the inner dimensions of yoga can be started. Antaranga Yoga involves 3 important stages. They are Dharana, Dhyana and Samadhi. And these 3 stages of Antaranga Yoga taken together is called as Samyama. Now let us move on to Dharana. Dharana basically is concentration. It is an attempt to fix the mind and the senses on an object of meditation. We know that it is very difficult to focus all the energies within the human personality as well as the mind on one single point. And therefore, it requires continuous practice to accomplish this. And dharana is basically the effort that is taken by the sadhaka to focus his or her energies on the object of meditation. So therefore, it is a voluntary process. It is a process of centering the mind. The object upon which the mind is fixed may be an external object, and as one progresses in different stages of yoga and as one advances in yoga, the object of meditation can be changed from the external to the internal. Initially, usually we begin with an external object which is largely an idol or an image of God. And then we move on to the images of God or the names of God as they are meditated within oneself. And as one progresses in stages of meditation, one moves on to more abstract pratyayas. Pratyaya is basically the object of meditation. It is advisable to begin with an external object or an image of God for a beginner. Now, moving on to the 7th limb of yoga, it is basically dhyana or meditation. Now, when dharana is accomplished and a person is completely focused on the object of meditation, then the process of meditation becomes spontaneous, natural, and there is a steady flow of energy and thoughts towards the object of meditation effortlessly. And when such an effortless flow of thought and energy is accomplished towards the object of meditation, it is then that we can say that a person has arrived at the stage of dhyana. Here, the cognition of the object that is fixed upon by the mind becomes continuous, like the flow of oil in which the drops are not distinguishable at all. Finally, we come to the last leg or the last limb of yoga, which marks the culmination of the process of yoga or the signs of yoga, and that is samadhi. Samadhi is a very, very tough, very, very difficult and very, very complex stage. Samadhi is the ultimate stage of yoga where the absorption in the object of meditation becomes perfect. This is basically a stage where the subject consciousness, the object consciousness, and the knowledge consciousness are fused into a state of oneness. And it is this fusing of the subject consciousness, the object consciousness, and knowledge consciousness which is basically the ultimate end of the process of yoga. Okay, and Samadhi, however, is a very, very complex process and it involves several stages. The stages of Samadhi can basically be broadly divided into Sabija Samadhi and Nirbija Samadhi. Sabija Samadhi is the stage of Samadhi wherein all the remnants of our karmas, or what we can call as the subtle counterparts of all the karmas that are performed by an individual, they are not completely rooted out of the human personality. They remain within the human personality, sometimes even in a rudimentary form. Nirbija stage is that stage of Samadhi wherein all the latent impressions of karma or the samskaras have been completely rooted out. They have been completely burned out of the human personality. And that therefore is the highest stage of Samadhi. So this is basically the point of difference between Sabija Samadhi and Nirbija Samadhi. As the term itself indicates, Sabija Samadhi is the Samadhi with the seed and Nirbija Samadhi is the Samadhi without the seed. Again, further, Sabija Samadhi is again divided into Samprajnata Samadhi and Asamprajnata Samadhi. Samprajnata Samadhi represents that stage of Samadhi, basically the early stage of Samadhi, wherein a complete union of the subject consciousness, object consciousness and knowledge consciousness has not been achieved. That is the stage of Samprajnata Samadhi, and it is a highly complex process and it further involves 4 fundamental steps. They are Savitarka Samadhi, Savichara Samadhi, Ananda Samadhi and Sasmita Samadhi. These are the 4 important stages of Samprajnata Samadhi. And as one moves on from one stage to the other, there is also a transition stage. And these transition stages can be marked out as the stages of Nirvitarka Samadhi, Nirvichara Samadhi, Nirananda Samadhi and Niramita Samadhi. There is also another stage of Samadhi which is called as Asamprajnata Samadhi, which also is part of Sabija Samadhi. And Asamprajnata Samadhi is that stage of Samadhi wherein the subject consciousness perfectly and completely fuses with the object consciousness. And there is a perfect identity of the subject consciousness, the knowledge consciousness and the object consciousness. The identity here is complete. But that is basically the stage of Asamprajnata Samadhi. But still, one has to remember that even the stage of Asamprajnata Samadhi is not the highest stage of Samadhi because it is also a stage of Sabija Samadhi. That means the latent impressions of karma, even in this condition, have not been completely rooted out. So that is still a part of Sabija Samadhi. Now we move on to what is called as the final stage of Samadhi, which is actually a form of Nirbija Samadhi, which is called as Dharma Megha Samadhi. And Dharma Megha Samadhi is the epitome of the process of yoga and is included in Nirbija Samadhi. And it is that stage of Samadhi wherein a person has developed the highest stage of discriminative knowledge, where a person can clearly distinguish between the 2 ultimate realities, that is Prakriti and Purusha, and the consciousness is completely identified with Purusha, and any kind of wrong identifications with Prakriti and its evolutes have been completely overcome. A person who is in the stage of Dharmameka Samadhi is in a constant stage of perfection of morality. Such a person never for even a moment swerves away from what is called as morality. The person is perfectly rooted in moral ideals. And if the person continues to live in this world, it is only for the welfare of the world at large. This notion is very similar to the concept of what is called as Loka Sangraha that is discussed in the Bhagavad-Gita. So, Dharma Megha Samadhi is that stage wherein a person has developed the greatest discriminative knowledge, and the person perfectly identifies himself or herself with the Purusha. And this stage is basically the stage of Kaivalya. And Kaivalya is the term that is used by the science of Sankhya to designate the highest end of human life. And the stage of Kaivalya here coincides with the highest stage of Samadhi, wherein a sadhaka has attained to the perfected stage of life, wherein a person is able to completely identify with Purusha and has withdrawn himself from any kind of association with Prakriti and its evolutes. Now moving on to the relevance of yoga. Yoga is a holistic science that attempts the perfection of the body and the mind. The important challenges that confront the human race today are both physical and mental, and such psychosomatic problems require a holistic approach for treatment, and yoga offers that much needed psychosomatic approach. And it is here that the world looks up to yoga as a solution for all the problems, the challenges that the world has thrown in front of humanity, that is of a psychosomatic nature. Thank you, one and all.